Hello and welcome. I am Edcel Javier Gonzalez, the current social media specialist here in the Department of English.
And I'm Michelle Peña. I'm a second year PhD student in English.
Awesome. And for reference, I'm currently a fourth year. And the reason why we're here today is because we want to talk about this incredible book we both have been reading, not only as part of Dr. Saloni's English for 540, which is a seminar for linguistics, but we found inspiration about talking about this book in the sense that this book has a lot to offer in terms of racial linguistic theory, which is the main focus we've been talking about this whole semester.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting themes and characters that are present that made us draw connections to that theory that we learned about, especially like the main character Jing Wen. Sorry. He's a Asian foreign student who moves from, we're guessing, China, because they don't really say where he's from, which I guess is kind of good because it
Hmm.
doesn't have you doing any type of racializing of the character in and of itself.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because this also makes me think of thinking about the white listening subject, for example, which has been a predominant topic in our seminar, kind of like it helps us not create that stereotype or bias about a person's language practices or antecedent knowledge of those language practices. So I think it's really interesting of how not mentioning the main character's country of origin has been helpful in terms of our linguistic analysis as well.
Yeah. I know there's moments within the book where I was curious to know how he was translating certain things over for himself, but then at the same time I thought that's not really important. What's important is his experience
Mm-hmm.
and how that translation is kind of being affected by the social cues and things that are happening around him. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I really agree with that. So before we talk more about the book, why don't we talk about what the book is in terms of main plot points, and then move a little bit of kind of like the more specifics of what we like about the book.
Yeah.
So for context, the book is titled Pie in the Sky. It's authored by Remy Lai or Remy Lai. So basically, I have been teaching this book as part of my English 170, which is Introduction to Children's Literature. But this whole year, I've been teaching as a diversity and equity class for children's literature, where basically we focus on the importance of BIPOC authors, what they have to offer. But what's interesting about Pie in the Sky is that I taught it as a non-Western children's hybrid prose book, as in it's a prose novel, meaning that it's written like a novel, but it has a lot of illustrations, comic strips, and useful visual cues that give us an extra understanding and perspective on the lives of Jingwen, Young Hao, and their mom, and how three of them as a family moved from their country of origin to Australia to live a new life. But it's also interesting because some of the topics that really interested me from the get-go is like this sense of culture shock that we see Jing Wang experiencing throughout the whole novel, and having him as like the main narrator of the story as well.
Yeah. I definitely thought that was really cool, especially since seeing it from his perspective as a child who is experiencing these things for the first time, experiencing these reactions and these kind of social interactions he's having with people who he's having a hard time communicating with, and it isn't even necessarily because he's not completely comprehending what they're saying. It's more of this association that's happening between him and who he is
Mm-hmm.
in relation to them, them racializing him.
Right. And another aspect I like about the book too is that if we were to use this in a literary cultural studies class, for example, or children's literature course, it also has a good critique on food ways or food culture within it, mostly because Jim Wayne's background and his whole family business have been baking.
Mm.
That's the reason why they moved to Australia. And it's really interesting how the author is infusing the topic too of this story, but what is in the case of linguistics and racial linguistics, I really like how this is one of the first books I've read that really shows me the experience of someone passing through language barriers, passing through culture shock in that aspect, which is really amazing to talk about because I think a lot of the readings we've done this semester really doesn't compensate how we think about language, especially how much we've socialized language to that let us to believe that there's one way that English should be spoken to, for example, but now we know that's not the case, especially when thinking about different, you know, different ways of how people perceive like tone and dialects, for example, and the importance of someone who is learning the language to communicate and to use it in the world and shouldn't be ashamed of that.
Yeah. That was one of the things. I don't know if you want to get started on some of the takeaways that we took from the text, but
Yes.
yeah, that was one of the things that really struck me within the book was how like it was like one of the more poignant moments for me was like where they first moved to Australia and Jinwang has like this association is everybody around him is alien to him, like everybody around him foreign creature. And but then as he begins like interacting with all of the people around him, he starts associating himself as the alien. Everybody else is human and he's not human. Like I think he even talks about he's slowly becoming human. I just thought that is so sad for one, but then it really shows how like just how I guess isolating and othering it can be for someone when they're trying to assimilate into the English language, especially given the popular ideas and ideologies connected to language and English speaking.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that. I found that very interesting, and it reminded me too of one of the articles we've had in class.
Mm-hmm.
I'm specifically referring to Flores and Rosa's 2015 article titled Undoing Appropriateness, Racial Linguistic Ideologies and Language Diversity in Education. Because one of the ideas they talk about in the article is this idea of appropriateness specifically, which leads me to believe, that within the world and we think of language ideologies, it's like in terms of ideology, specifically how English language learning and teaching has been treated, there's always an aim where when people are learning English as a target or second language, they have to learn it the same way as someone who speaks like authentic English or the correct way of English.
Yeah.
So, for example, we can think of ways, in Australia's case, how people in the UK speak English, for example. Also keeping in mind like colonial histories. In our context, within Western media, how people in the US or in America, quote unquote, speak English, and how we are socialized to believe that that is the appropriate way to speak English.
Yeah.
But thanks to all the theory we've read in class, we know that that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah. There's definitely this one moment specifically that really reminded me of that article, which was Jin Wang's neighbor, his interaction with her. I have a
Mm,
little quote. I don't know if you want me to read it or not. Should I
yeah, for
read it?
sure. Yeah.
So it's like he's like interacting with her, and he sees her as he's coming out of their apartment, and he says, she says, "It is warm today, isn't it?" Anna talks like a robot, each English word pronounced clearly with a pause between words that ends with a T is uttered with an exaggerated sound like the farting noise buses make when they pull in and out of stops. Yang Ho glances at me. I shrug. It warm today, he says. It is warm today, Anna corrects. And it's like she's doing that work of trying to say, hey, you're not talking appropriately. And she's doing it without saying that explicitly. Like she's modeling for them. But like obviously, as we've talked about in association and what that article talks about is like appropriateness isn't necessarily I guess, the correct word to use when you're talking about English language speaking. And like, there are lots of different ways to speak English. I mean, it's not like the message of what his younger brother was saying was lost on
Mm-hmm.
her. Like, she knew what he was saying. Um, yeah, I can understand why there's kind of some tension between Jinwen and his neighbor.
Yep. Especially, gosh, if I had like a nosy neighbor like that, I will be in tension all the time as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I would not want to be like, I would be like dodging that woman. Nothing.
I'll be like, bye.
Yep, yep.
But
um, but yeah, I mean, other than that one, I know it also kind of like there's also another moment in the text, and it's specifically when it's talking about his schooling. And like for one, they have no appropriate way to like even help him assimilate into that culture and into that environment and community. And so he was kind of just thrown in amongst these students and told, you'll learn English eventually, like figure it out, kid.
just like magic,
Yeah.
because all it takes is me to be thrown in a space and I'll magically learn the language.
Yeah. I mean, lucky for him, he was actually able to pick stuff up, but like, it's not easy. I know I've never been one to like pick up language very easily. I don't know what it is. It's just something in my brain doesn't want me to learn a different language. But anyway, there's this moment where he says, I'm supposed to start sixth grade in Australia since I graduated fifth grade last year, but the principal of Northbridge Primary School reckons my English is poor. So it's easier for me to repeat fifth grade. And so not only does that connect to the appropriateness article, but that also connects to Flores's other article that we talked about in class called Technically an EL, the production of racial linguistic categories in dual language school. And so while they do talk about this in context of Latinx students in dual language schools, it does bring up this issue of languagelessness.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and what I like about Flores' 2020 article, Technically an EL, is that, like you mentioned, talking about Latinx students particularly, but I think it also does a great job in also critiquing like how schools categorize students based on their how many languages they learn or like their mastery of it.
Mm-hmm.
And combining this with the book, I like how the book is indirectly also making a critique of not only this, of like how the school's not really prepared for, you know, um, helping students adopt with the language, which will be English in this case. Um, I said adopt, but I meant adapt.
Yeah.
Not editing that, so let's keep it as a funny bit.
Okay.
But anyway, um, not only to adapt with the language, but also it's kind of strange me reading Pie in the Sky, and there was never a moment where Jing Wang was referred to like a language professional, for example, or someone in the school contacting his mom, advising her to, help him with some like ESL strategies, to help him learn the language and adapt with that. And it seems like the teachers, while not all of them, because Mr. Hart, which Jinwei calls Mr. Fart, and you can all guess why the nickname, but lots of these teachers seem like they're not really trained to work with this population of students. And again, the book is basically perceiving that both Jinwei and Yang Hao are basically the only ones that haven't mastered English as the language yet, which again, we can interpret that the school doesn't have this population of students all the time, but regardless, it doesn't mean that, the school should be prepared for this kind of situation, especially how people do migrate in different parts of the world and do need that service for them as well.
Yeah, I know a moment in the text where, okay, it has to do with the technically an EL article. I know that. And so this idea of languagelessness, it not only connects to the way that he is like perceived by Anna, by the neighbor, but it's also perceived by like his classmates. And I know like within the text, there's like depictions of like this like foreign language being spoken, and it's like in all of these hieroglyphics rather than, and that's how he's kind of like hearing things and comprehending things. But then that's also how people are hearing and comprehending him as well. And so I think that like he's kind of seen as this languageless being, this
Mm.
person who can't communicate, who can't like assert what his ideas and feelings are throughout the text to the people around him other than his brother and his mother, younger than him, and not really being able to fully grasp certain ideas and things that he's feeling and going through. And then his mother, who's just really, really busy and is trying to make time for her sons, but obviously can't, given like what she has to do and like how she has to provide for them.
Right. And I just want to mention these few things because even though we're not talking about them specifically, I think they're important to keep in mind as part of the discussion. Um, so Yin Wei and Yang Hao, they're only 2 years apart. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's also interesting with how the younger brother is able to adapt to the language faster than the older brother. And there's a lot of factors that come with that. Um, but again, I'm also thinking of the mom because obviously she being only the main breadwinner of the house, she's also apparently a single mom too, and I think
Yeah.
that has a huge toll in the storyline as well. And I think these are topics people don't really think about, but they do have to do a lot to understand the family situation and also social situation and also all the anxiety Jing Wei is facing right now because him being the older brother. And again, the book talks about this, and it can be seen in the narrative as well. Like him having the pressure of being the older brother, kind of being the man in the house. We want to give it a more gender perspective in that
Yeah.
sense. It's a lot of pressure that comes with him. In the book, even the grandparents through mail do tell Jingwei that you're the older one, you're the one in charge. So it's like, wow, that's a lot of pressure for a 10/11-year-old kid because I say 10/11 because his birthday does pass throughout the novel,
Yeah.
but still, it's like, when there became a chance where basically you have to speed up your growth and basically childhood's over because now you have all these other responsibilities. And it's interesting because this being technically a middle grade novel, it does have a lot of these themes that we can use to analyze from a children's literature perspective, which cultural perspective, also being ancient literature, and also through a little bit crossing young adult literature as well,
Mm-hmm.
since middle grade does serve as like that transition period where, we're seeing older kids getting more responsibilities and getting that chance to experience another lifestyle, another transition within their life, so to speak.
Yeah. And bouncing off of like how you were talking about his brother, um, he is adapting to English a lot faster than Jinwen in the book, but he's also kind of like this anchor for him. At least that's how I read him, because I know, especially within this one specific moment when he's thinking of himself as slow and he can't stop thinking of the word. Like the word slow just keeps popping, and he's starting to like really feel like the pressure to like learn English, but also like feels just pressure in general. And so there was this one moment where he says, I mean, I didn't know this cake we're making is on the menu for pie in the sky. My heart skips a beat. No one has ever mentioned pie in the sky since the accident either. And so that's the little brother saying that he didn't know that it was on the menu.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like this is like his brother is kind of snapping him back to like, hey, like you're not alone, like anchoring you back to like not only reality out of his own head, but also like anchoring him back to his culture and his like roots, and like reminding him of his dad, because I think his dad is definitely like that stand-in for like where he came from
Mm-hmm.
and who he was and like and who he is. Like you're not only where you're going, you are what you've done as well. Like you're everything. Like you're those things combined. And so like it kind of reminded me of like how the students in Angela Reyes's article, the voicing of Asian American figures, Korean linguistic styles at an Asian American cram school, how she kind of talks about how those students were creating community with one another through the ways that they were talking to one another. And while this isn't so much coded language, this is still like language, or like this is still something that his brother is saying that is specific to them both,
Mm-hmm.
specific to their little family community that they still have.
Yeah, I agree with that very much. So, and because again, for the most of the book, and this is something that's also related to the discussion of the novel, is this lovely sense of brotherhood that we experience with Pie in the Sky. And again, something that something that we don't experience a lot with literature in general. It's like that sort of sibling bonding that we see. And I think it's very beautiful the way it's being interpreted as well as like, yes, just like real brothers, they have lots of fights. They call each other booger, and we have all those funny bits too. Because again, me having an older sister, that kind of comes with that. My perspective, like the younger sibling, but
Same. I'm the younger sibling
oh, cool.
too.
But yeah, it's really interesting how all this also connects with their bonding, but also kind of like that sort of encouragement for language learning and language motivation, I want to say as well. This also reminds me of the next point I wanted to bring up. So I'm referencing Young's article that's titled The Creolization of Asian American Rhetoric.
Mhm.
But I'm specifically referring to Kanagaraja's part of this particular article. And this one, and I'm quoting from the article, it says, and I quote, encourages us to treat acts of communication as involving more than words. We have to treat communication as an alignment of words with many other semiotic resources involving different symbol systems, i.e., icons, images, modalities of communication, i.e., oral, visual, and tactical channels, and ecologies, social, material, context of communication. And why? So I'm referencing this first quote because I'm thinking of like all the other material that Jim Wei is involved in the school, kind of like the different texts he reads. He references the dictionary a lot for second language learning. What we discussed with Anna the neighbor too, that even though it was like a little bit annoying and cringy, it's still considered a kind of example of the ecology and communication modalities around him. And I'm seeing this more as like moments where he has access to learn English, but effective as you want to see because of that anxiety that he's going through. That's correlating to his ability to learn English, whether how fast he can learn or how fast he can adapt with that. Which also reminds me of his next quote. However, the term translingual enables a consideration of communicative competence as not restricted to predefined meanings of individual languages, but the ability to merge different language resources in situated interactions for new meaning constructions. So, for this, I see that taking into consideration all the language ecologies that we have in the book or the communication mediums, if use it a more positive modality, I think that will help a lot in Jinwei's case to learn language. But sadly, as we see in a lot of parts of the book, that's something we don't really get to experience, especially in the very beginning where Mr. Hard, which I'm gonna name Mr. Fart from now on, because that's how Jinwei's narrative is basically not helping him achieve that goal. And I'm gonna quote a few pages, which I'm also gonna add the image as part of the podcast. Where Jim Waits at a day at school, and Mr. Ford is basically asking him to read a part of the book that they're studying, discussing in class. I'm quoting from Janeway's perspective. I tried to read Mr. Fart's deadpan face for clues about whether I was saying the words right or wrong. So I like this part because we're basically visualizing how Jin Wei is very attentive to the modalities of communication, Mr. Fart's facial expressions. As we can see in the illustration, it's Mr. Fart's like very serious and like kind of like in this mood. I don't know. This guy's looking at Janeway like he's judging him and like almost angry.
Yeah.
At least that's how I'm interpreting that. Kind of like, wow, that's not how a teacher should act at all. But I'm critiquing this, me being an educator myself, and me going through all this training and believing that a positive output for students is what they really need to achieve those language goals.
Yeah.
So I continue. Only for fingers fiercely tapping on his thigh tell me to hurry up. Wow, that's a lot of modes of communication right here. Then I get a whole kind of message from someone else, Max, who sits a few rows ahead to my right, is looking at me. Time. Stops. He quickly looks away, just like the girls on the bus. I wipe my gaze back down to the textbook so fast I probably need one of these protection from vampire bite neck braces. Whenever Mr. Fard makes me read, a couple of classmates steal glances my way, which I think is reasonable since they must all be confused. I don't even know what I'm blabbering. How could they? Most of my classmates are kind enough to openly gossip. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're all like that girl on the bus. They all think I'm an alien. Maybe they're all like Joe and Max. They all think I'm slow. And I'm reading slow like that because the way it's being presented in the text is an ecology of writing, which we also talked about in class too, how different authors, especially BIPOC authors, have different rhetorical cues and decisions in terms of not only interpreting that they're using their home language, but how they're perceiving their own sense of language as well, which I find really fascinating. So here, slow is in italics and it's separate, like SLOW, if I were actually reading it slow. So, back to the quote, they all think I'm slow, I'm stupid, I'm a joke. And then we have illustrations of Mr. Ford saying, Janeway, there's more. Janeway keeps reading. He's sweating a lot, feeling very nervous until Mr. Ford says, Thank you, Janeway, and he stops trying to read. And that's where we have this image in the next page where everything he reads is the word slow constantly. So here we have an idea of how basically within his mind, he himself has believed that he's slow. And, him learning the language, him adapting to the culture is also very embodied and perceived as that a very slow process.
Yeah. I know, like, some when you were talking about imagery, like the modalities of language, I know that's one of the things that we talked about in class, or at least you brought up in class in association with his mom not letting him get like cooking books to learn English from, or to like just read and look at. And I think like I didn't realize how important images are for like learning a language. Like they are so important. And so like he could have probably, we don't know because she didn't let him, but like he could have probably picked up like English words and like different phrases a little bit more easily had she actually like allowed him to like take out these books on cooking. And of course we know why she didn't, and that's because they did come to the country with like trauma from losing her husband and their father in an accident. So I mean, like you said, all of those social factors definitely played a part in in how they assimilated or how they kind of like began to structure their lives within Australia.
Yeah, and it just reminded me of one of my favorite quotes from Lewin Horner's 2013 article,
Mm-hmm.
Translingual Literacies, Language Differences, and Matters of Agency. I'm just going to read this quote and then talk a little bit about it because I
Mm-hmm.
also want to reflect on how the book is also helping us think of our own pedagogy in terms of how can we use this book in a really practical way if we were teaching a future class too, and how will we apply this theory we've been talking about as well.
Yeah.
So, and I quote from Lewin Horner, we need to learn to recognize and help students learn to recognize the kinds of difference they are already making in their writing. And we can also say this in their language practices as well, and that they might wish to make and how. And I think student input is so important
Mm-hmm.
um, because, again, we as educators, we're guiding them and helping them reach that goal into mastering English as a second language, target language, but with the angle of them using the language to communicate on a daily basis and be able to live their best lives, practically. Um, so Mr. Fart's example, I really cringe a lot because there's no empathy, there's no kindness in the way that he's basically working with Jing Wang, because he's basically alienating him indirectly by calling him out in that sense. Because again, read out loud, it is a useful tool for English teachers and for ESL learning as well. But if you know that the student doesn't feel comfortable with reading, you're basically just calling him out and making him look ridiculous in front of everyone, which is prone to like other problems that he may have in school as well.
Yeah.
Um,
That's definitely, I think, like it's obvious almost. Well, not, it's obvious to me, but it might not be obvious to other people that like you don't treat a student like that. Like you don't, like pedagogically, that's not sound. Like to like have a student who is struggling at least a little bit with their own comprehension and their own kind of like understanding of like what it is you're reading, and how they're reading is like you can tell when somebody feels self-conscious with reading out loud. And like the fact that he repeatedly forced him to do this, because it is talked about in the text how he makes him do it all the time. Yeah, I think that's just a model for like what not to do, for how not to interact with your ESL student.
Right. And I think we reached a point where we can just think of final thoughts and just reflect on what this book meant to us. Because definitely taking into consideration all the different articles and language and topics of virtualized language that we learned throughout the semester, I'm really interested in maybe having a future 170 not only read Pie in the Sky, but also maybe ask students to deeply reflect on their own experiences with language learning, kind of like applying all the theory we've learned, what it really means, like them as a reader, reading about the experiences of this 11-year-old child who is really struggling in different facets. So maybe an assignment where we not only reflect, but we kind of build that like home language autobiography. And I say home because a lot of the actions that happen in Pie in the Sky, a lot of it is in home, and that relativeness to home, to his father as well, and to baking. So I think it's really interesting making an assignment like that and reflecting of like all these different aspects and how do we see language learning as a different way in terms of what we can do in order to recommend resources, build resources to make students' lives a lot more feasible, a lot more accessible, so that way they don't struggle as much as Jim Way has struggled within Pie in the Sky.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I definitely like have thought about how I would use this text. But my like research is so specific that like I feel like it would be difficult, but at the same time, I would be really interested in seeing how students react to this text in a classroom setting. I guess if I taught 101, and I usually do have a unit on like appropriateness, like language appropriateness. And I feel like I would probably pair this text or parts of this text, at least for them, with the appropriateness article that we talked about from Flores and Rosa. And like I would probably like have them talk about like, well, what is appropriate? How do we know how language how do we define how language is appropriate? And like yeah, like just construct an activity for them to do that. I know I'm definitely going to be using a lot of this theory we've learned in class for talking about like my teaching internship next semester,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm going to be talking about native texts. We're going to be talking about translation a lot and like what is done in translation and how translation is affecting the different works that are being relayed to people, and like how translating it from one language to the other, something might be lost or something could be misunderstood. And yeah, so I can definitely see myself dipping back into these articles for that.
Yeah, same. I do have plans to use Pie in the Sky as a chapter for my dissertation,
Mm-hmm.
mostly because mental health is a huge theme of it
Mm-hmm.
as well as anxiety, which goes inside mental health as well. So I'm really excited to pick key moments of the novel because, again, for a chapter, I can't dedicate the whole book in a chapter. I will never end this dissertation project, but
Yeah.
I'm definitely interested to pick up those specific moments and dive back to some of the articles we've read this semester as well.
Yeah, I think this would definitely pair well with a literacy narrative too, because like the literacy narrative assignment I typically have my students do in 101, just because like it is from the first person and it is talked about. It is his literacy, a
Mm-hmm.
literacy narrative. And he's talking about how he's becoming literate in this society, in this community, in this language, and like how he's learning to traverse all of those things, which is definitely like ideas and concepts I want my students to understand when they go into that unit.
Yeah, I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Michelle, thank you so much. This has been wonderful talking to you about Pie in the Sky, a book that's very close to my heart. And, I've really had fun doing this video podcast and also audio podcast with you.
Yeah, it was fun. It is a happy, sad book. is all I'll say. And the sad parts are not the ones that I expected to be in there. So
Yes.
thanks for almost making me cry, Edcel.
Well, I mean, I always say if the book doesn't make you cry, it's a really good book.
Yeah, it's true.
I mean, I don't always say that, but you know.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Now you do.
but yeah, fair warning. Obviously we didn't talk about some of the major plot points just to avoid spoilers, but this book is sad, and the reason and basically we don't find out of what happens with the family situation till like mid novel almost. So again, I recommend this book. It's an amazing book. You should all read it, but I am gonna warn you, it will and it might or will, depending how strong your emotions are or you as a person, it might or will make you sad. So you know, just a warning ahead of time. Thank you so much for listening to us. We will. We do have plans to add both the audio and video recording in the English department website as part of the ongoing podcasting lab here in the English department ISU. It's in our Press Play podcasting lab. And yeah, thank you so much for listening to us. Goodbye.
Bye.